Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and I think it's 12:15, so we will begin. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everybody here in person and also to those of you who are joining on Zoom. Welcome as well. And welcome to this seminar in the STL being the Peking University School of Transnational Law, Beijing 大学国际法学院 Law and Humanities Seminar Series. My name is Norman Ho, and it is our great pleasure and honor today to have as our speaker, Professor Xingzhong Yu, or in Chinese, Yu Xingzhong, Professor Yu Xingzhong. Professor Yu is currently chair professor of law at the University of Macau, and his research interests include Chinese law and legal history, social theory, comparative legal philosophy, constitutional law, and intelligent technology and law. Prior to joining the University of Macau faculty, Professor Yu taught for many years at Cornell Law School in the United States, where he served as the Anthony W. and Lulu C. Wang Professor of Law, and has also held appointments at various universities in China, including PKU, Jilin University, Shandong University, Northwest University of Politics and Law, and is the author of numerous books and articles in the area of jurisprudence and Chinese legal theory. And Professor Yu will speak today on the topic of normative dualism, one way to understand Confucian legal thought. Professor Yu will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which we will open the floor for questions. I would like to give the floor now to Professor Yu. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Norman, for that very nice introduction. Thank you all for coming to this presentation here. My topic today is very straightforward. It's called normative dualism, one way to understand Confucian legal thought. Basically, it is one way to understand the Confucian legal thought. Whether there was a Confucian legal thought, that is another matter. Okay, it's not within my description today. So this is about a historical figure, yet it has some implications about the present. But I guess this will be implicit, not will be explicitly explored in my presentation. Okay, I plan to go like this. First of all, the concept of normative dualism. Then I will move on to talk about the dialectical practical reason, that is something supporting the idea of normative dualism. Then, of course, the familiar philosophy of yin and yang. And then I will talk about the order and disorder. This part, I guess, most of you probably will not be familiar with. I will spend some time on that. Then I will talk about the major tenets of normative dualism. Then some conclusions. Well, probably I will just skip the conclusions and I will stop at the number 5 major tenets of normative dualism. Okay, that's my plan. Again, I guess you're most welcome to ask questions anytime. If you find that my presentation is interesting or not interesting, or if there is a mistake or anything, just let me know. Okay, great. So the concept of normative dualism, this came to my mind, attention, because when I read the Analects, all know about the Analects, right? Which is a book compiled by many people, but contributed actually as one work, major work of Confucius. But we don't know, whether that is true or not. So in Analects, in chapter 2, it talking about governance, how to govern. There are some sentences here that I find very interesting. 道之以政，齐之以刑，民免而无耻；道之以德，齐之以礼，有耻且格。 About the translation of these two basic sentences to this paragraph, so to speak, there are differences. Many people translate it as law or as punishments and so on and so forth. I will explain to you, of course. In my view, this is what I call normative dualism. That is using one type of normative system to regulate the positive side of life, and using another system to regulate the negative side of our life. This is what I call normative dualism. That is, you will use two systems instead of one system. Okay, we know that in history, in Western history and Chinese history, basically normative systems, regulative systems were diverse, very diverse. There were two or three, maybe not only two, the three or four types of regulative or normative systems. Yet we know that since the Renaissance and since we got into modernization period, modern period, we know that we have been talking about what is called the rule of law, right? And the rule of law became the model of the whole world. So that is one kind of system. We know the religion and morality became less important as the law. So when we talk about the modern democracy system, we talk about the rule of law as one single unitary, in fact, system of regulation. That is in contrast to what I would call normative dualism in China. Okay, that's my question, in fact. So in this paragraph, in fact, Confucius talked about the four things. Okay. If you look at the English translation, the first one done by a great master, but the translation obviously needs to be improved. It says that the master said, if the people be led by laws, look at that here, laws, and uniformity sought to be given them by punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment, but have no sense of shame. Okay. If they be led by virtue and uniformity sought to be given them by the rule of propriety, they will have the sense of shame and moreover will become good. Okay, this is a kind of translation. I want to bring to your attention. There are four things here that this paragraph mentioned. One is zheng, that is translated as laws. The other is xing, that's punishment. Then the other is called de, that's, so to speak, virtue or rita, whatever you call it. Then the last one is called the rules of propriety, li. Okay, so there are four types of regulatory systems, four types of concepts, four types of things. These four types actually grouped into two camps. One camp is rule of law, rule of zheng, and then punishment. The other is rule of de and the rules of priority. It's two types of things. Okay, in contrast, Confucius was obviously preferred the latter one. That is, if you lead people by virtue, and then uniformity or whatever is sought by rules of propriety, then you will have a extremely nice, wonderful time, wonderful way to rule the country. So that some enthusiasts would say that in Chinese history, in very long history, okay, including the Xia dynasty, even though we don't have any evidence of the existence of that dynasty. I guess you all know. But now recently, they have discovered a lot of calligraphies from even earlier period. So some people would say, well, no, Chinese history certainly extended more further to Xia dynasty. There were even more, earlier dynasties and so on. But these were discussions, people's views. But the ideal dynasty or the ideal situation, according to Confucius, was the Zhou dynasty. That's where people actually relied on the rules of propriety, 理智. Okay. And some later discussions preferred to say that, these may be rule of propriety may be only kind of ideal, which never existed. Okay. But what instead existed is what is called probably pragmatic instrumentalism. That is basically something that the Hanfei, Shangyang, and those legalists prefer. Okay, and others would say, in Chinese history, there were rule of virtue. Okay, in fact, if you look at history very, very carefully, you probably would come to the conclusion that neither rule of propriety nor rule of the virtue ever existed in China. What existed throughout Chinese history, and even up to now, is what is called rule of Zheng. That is the second, that's the first category that this paragraph talked about. The idea of Zheng. Let me show you this term here. Later I will explain, of course, more. This is really, really what has happened in Chinese history. Okay, but this dualism existed in terms of rhetoric. Okay, also in terms of ideology that people would employ when they try to rule over the country. I guess most of you would be familiar with the Chinese history, right? In fact, Chinese history has its unique law. That unique law has not been well explained, well studied. We now only see what we call the civilized theories about Chinese history. But in fact, in China, we had so many dynasties, 25 or 34, you might well say, dynasties. All these dynasties, emerged violently, not in civilized process. So a part of Chinese history should be the history of violence in China. That has never been explored. Okay, if you put that part into consideration and take that part into consideration about Chinese legal history, then you will realize that in these kind of situation, law or virtue or rule of priority will not really help, because once I get the power, the political power, the first thing I want to do, like everybody wants to do, is to control, right? Is to ask your people to obey you, right? So whatever means exist, whatever means you actually have, you probably would use that. Okay, so instead of using rule of De or rule of Li to describe a Chinese legal history, I think probably the use of rule of Zheng is a better way to define it. But this dualism has been used by each dynasty. Once they got the power, they would try to rule, right? When they rule, they need many things. This dualism is certainly one of the effective methods that they use. And unfortunately, this actually have been passed down from the history to until before the 1911 revolution. Okay, people in China believed that this kind of rule of the or rule of priority actually was their only correct choice and so on. So that was about the concept of normative dualism. In fact, this dichotomy has summarized the basic features of normative dualism that I already talked about. Instead of talking about the rule of the virtue or rule of priority, I guess rule of government maneuver is probably the most appropriate way to describe it. As I said just now, the translation of the term Zheng is very problematic. It was initially translated as law, then translated as rules, then translated as decrees, and so on. But the only correct translation, from my point of view, from my perspective, is done by Simon Leys, who used to teach at Australia National University, who translated this term Zheng as government maneuvers. So throughout history, you will see government maneuvers even up to now, with the existence of extensive legal framework, you still see government maneuver plays a very significant role. Why is that there's this kind of normative dualism? If we want to look at the roots, I guess we have to look at what people believe to be certain type of dialectical practical reason, which is grown from Taoism. I think many of you are familiar with Taoism. This seemed to be a kind of inner logic of Chinese history and Chinese culture. You will look at the yin and yang, you will look at heaven, earth, separation and unity, static, dynamic, rituals, and law, and so on, this kind of dichotomy. But what is important is that there's a unity among these two things. That is, looking at things not only from one perspective, but from two perspectives, from both positive and negative. Okay, from order and disorder, instead of only looking at how you actually manage your order and so on. So this as a philosophically, this might be called dialectical practical reason. It's a kind of practical reason, but it's a dialectical, and looking at things in two ways, not just one way. And this picture here is very familiar to you. Yin and yang, right? You know that the yin and yang actually this kind of philosophy, philosophical foundation. When it was first proposed, it did not mean anything bad. It was just a kind of understanding, kind of neutral philosophy, so to speak. But later on, in subsequent dynasties, the doctrine acquired very negative meanings. We all know about women are treated as yin, men is treated as yang, right? Women are inferior to men, and so on. Many kind of things like that. But that was not the original meaning of yin and yang. This is from Huangzi Neijing. I guess that's a Chinese medical classic. Probably some of you have read it. Heaven was created by the concentration of the yang, the force of light, right? The earth was created by the central concentration of yin, the forces of darkness. Yang stands for peace and serenity. Yin stands for confusion and turmoil. Yang stands for destruction. Yin stands for conservation. Yang brings about disintegration, yin gives shape to things, and so on. This was the description from that medical classic. But if you are familiar with the Taoism, you know, in Taoism, the first paragraph, beginning, they talked about this, how Tao actually produced one produced two produced three, blah, blah. This I have never understood, in fact. I don't know if any of you understood it or not. And a few words about the Taoism. We know that the Taoism have been actually revised numerous times throughout Chinese dynasties. From the classics that unearthed in Wuhan, right, in Ma Wangdui, you know that the arrangement of the chapters, De and Dao, De Jing, is actually precedes Dao. And there are many revisions, or, you know, purposefully, or you know, just for scholarly interest and so on. So Tao is a kind of way to unify this normative dualism. You have two aspects of things, but these two aspects of things will be unified so that you will have eventually a kind of better understanding of the world, of the nature, and of, you know, political systems, human institutions, and so on and so forth. That was Taoism. Then in law, we know that Dong Zhongshu, some of you might be familiar with him. He was the person who served as major figure of Confucianist in Han Dynasty. It was him who basically said only Confucianism could serve our purpose. All the other schools of thought are nothing. You know, they were basically wrong. They shouldn't be actually spelled out. They should not, you know, occupy any space in our ideology or in our culture. I guess most of you know that in spring and autumn period, that was probably the best time in China, right? Freedom of thought, freedom of movement, and that kind of things existed at that time. You could actually say whatever you want to say, right? If you have ideas, you could travel to, you know, give your advice to different princes, kings, and so on. At that time, China was really in chaos. In terms of chaos, in front of chaos, what are you going to do? You probably would have different views, but certainly you could have only three types of views. One view is that let's go back to the old tradition. It is, we are facing this kind of situation simply because we forgot our tradition. Go back to tradition, that is Confucianism, right? The other way is basically says, no. Let's forget about tradition. Let's see what we can do about now. Let's see what we can do about the future. So let's do reform. Let's, you know, design new types of institutions and so on and so forth. So these would be legalists, right? A third way of looking at this kind of chaos is Taoism. Basically says, okay, keep away from this, what is happening. And the less you interfere with, the better things will be. So don't get involved. That is kind of a, Taoist idea. But recently, I noticed that there were discussions about Taoism, saying that Taoism may not be that negative, may not be that passive about society, about social progress, and so on. If you insist on Taoism as a kind of guidance for law, instead of talking about the Li Fa, now I guess many Chinese legal historians would talk about Chinese legal history as characterized as Li Fa. That's rituals and law, or rules of propriety and law. But some would say probably the correct way would be Dao Fa. That is Dao plus law. Law has to be, in accordance with the Dao. As to what Dao is, that's of course even more complex question, right? It's hard to define, but Dao is certainly concerned with the Tian. Okay, that's another concept that is important in Chinese legal history here. Now, Dong Zhongshu then said, well, anything, any other schools of thought are wrong simply, let's just keep to Confucianism. And he has specifically said that when discussing the role of De and Xing, that is virtue and punishment, the law of heaven and earth resides in yin and yang. Yang is the virtue. This gives meaning, virtue to yang of heaven, while yin is the punishment, Xing of heaven. Okay. Then spring and summer belong to yang, and it is the time to practice governance by virtue. Autumn and winter belong to yin, and it is the time to carry out punishments. I think if you are familiar with Chinese legal history, you know that this is exactly what happened. When they wanted to execute criminals, they would do that in autumn or winter, rather than in the spring or summer, right? So yin and yang actually used specifically by Dong Zhongshu as kind of normative dualism in Chinese history. This brings up another concept, that is order and disorder. Okay. Remember that at the beginning I talked about the four systems of regulation, four systems of normative systems. And then their foundation, philosophical foundation, is yin and yang. Yin and yang eventually lead to the idea of order and disorder. This is very different from our understanding of Chinese legal history and our understanding of legal histories of other countries. Now, this is eventually, if I want to use a diagram to talk about normative dualism, this is it. Okay. Now, if you look at this right side, virtue, rules of propriety, government maneuvers, De, Li, Zheng. These are three major positive values. Virtue basically is kind of ideal. It expects that all these people who will or who are actually ruling should have virtue, right? And it's said that the virtue, the emperor should have virtue because the virtue is given by God, by heaven, not God, by heaven. If you fail to stick to the virtue from the heaven, then you might lose the legitimacy to rule the country. Your dynasty might be overthrown by somebody else. That's virtue. The rules of propriety, that's another concept. this was basically sacrificial rules, then later developed into behavioral codes for aristocrats. That is, people who are in high positions in society, so that they would behave themselves. Rules of priority are actually also rules, specific rules. In each dynasty, they have not only law, but also rules of propriety, like 唐典. In Song Dynasty, they also have dian. No, right. Then, of course, government maneuvers. Basically, as I said, Chinese history has set a special law, right? When you actually grab the power, political power, what you will do is immediately is to control it, right? Maintain, solidify it, maintain it, and you control your subjects. Okay, whatever way is available will be good. So government maneuvers more flexible than other types of things, that regular types of law and so on and so forth. Then there's the concept of punishment. That is the idea of law in China. Punishment at that time means law. Okay, law, that's the position of law. Now, if you look at this, suppose that you were a person in China, you lived in one of these dynasties. Okay, you were expected to develop your virtue as individual or as an institution, as rulers, as those being ruled. You develop your virtue first. Okay, and if the virtue does not work for you, then we rely on the rules of propriety. You must observe rules of propriety. If rules of propriety fail, if you do not observe it, then you have to obey government maneuvers. Okay, you have to implement whatever the government, whatever the emperor or emperor's agencies said. You have to do that. Failing all this, you will be moved to the other sphere, that is punishment. That's why, that partially explains why Chinese punishments are so cruel. You remember, right? At the end of, at the beginning actually of the 19th century, end of 18th century, there were demands from overseas, from a lot of countries, to reform Chinese legal system, because Chinese legal system is too barbarous. And if you have seen those, punishments, one of them is called lynch, cutting into 1,000 pieces. That kind of punishment. That's really, really barbarous, right? But that was justified. Why that was justified? That was because you have failed this positive side. When you fail this positive side, you become a non-person. You're no longer as a human being. So you do not talk about your human rights if you being a criminal. You do not talk about how you should be protected, how you have your personal dignity, and so on. That is beyond this sphere. That should be in the positive side. So normative dualism, if essentially, is a kind of way to rule, to define, to divide a general order into order and disorder. So if you are behaving, if you live in the in common order, regular order, then you are good. Okay, you will be a good subject. But if you happen to have some kind of crimes, minor crimes, or civil crimes, you belong to this field, and then that is disorder. So in terms of the ways to deal with order and disorder, they had different views, different types of systems. So finally, I think probably it would be useful to talk about some of the major tenets of normative dualism. I actually introduced this already at the beginning of the class. 德理正心, okay. 德 virtue. You could translate that as virtue. There are many types of virtue, of course. And li, that's the rules of propriety. Okay. 正, this is exactly what I want to emphasize. Actually, I have written about it. This is exactly when people say China used to have rule of law or rule of the, I would say neither is true. What China had was a rule of Zheng, that is government maneuvers. That is even now, I think, still relevant. Rule of Zheng, rather than rule of law or rule of virtue. Okay. Then the fourth term is Xing, punishment, right? Punishment, we talked about that. This is the originally, this de means, does not have the concept of virtue, but it has a sympathy. Means you be kind to the prisoners in war. You know, when you got prisoners, you should be kindly treat them. That is the later on, of course, in Zhou Dynasty, Zhou Gong tried to link the word de with heaven, with Tian, so that they got their political legitimacy. Okay, when we talk about the political legitimacy, we know that this is a problem that has not been solved in China, right? There are so many dynasties. Their legitimacy basically coming from their fists, from their might, rather than having a civilized form, a little bit like election, you know, or democracy and so on. These kind of things. Basically, it was sacrificial rules. If you visit the museums, the Chinese museums, and some of the museums, in fact, in overseas, I guess, Metro, Met, and Louvre, many museums you would see Chinese utensils, and these utensils were sacrificial utensils. Used for sacrificial rules. Okay, but later on it became rules of conduct of aristocrats. But it collapsed in spring and autumn period, then disintegrated into official rules of conduct, family rules, and social etiquette, and so on and so forth. So that when you talk about the idea of li in China, it becomes very complicated. It touches not only upon the life of the government officials, it also has to do with the ordinary people. So in rural areas in China, you know that even though people did not have very good education, yet they know about the rules of propriety. They know about li. When they get married, they have a certain type of li, certain types of when somebody passed away, they have a way of dealing with that using this kind of things. Then Zheng. Zheng is a kind of term that has not been very well discussed, as I said. Could mean governance or policy, ethics, government maneuver, or even agricultural management, etc., etc. So this could be a very good research topic. In fact, in order to understand the Chinese history, Chinese political and legal history, you have to understand the term Zheng. Zheng explained in legalist concepts. For instance, from Han Fei's point of view, we know that Han Fei is the person who actually represent the whole legal, legalist camp, the whole camp. In fact, his rulership is 法术士, right? Law, tactics, and 士. He developed this from Sheng Dao and Sheng Buhai and Shangyang and so on. But we don't know what the shi is, in fact, because we don't have enough materials, evidence to discuss this. But it could be explained as that even if we adopt legalist philosophy, some say that the legalist philosophy, in fact, in Chinese history, played the role of rule of law. But even if we adopt legalist view, we know that they were not only talking about law, rule of law. They were talking about something else, tactics, and this positioning. Positioning is basically authority, or kind of things that could be had when you have power. These actually all combine together to form the idea of Zheng, rule of Zheng, rather than rule of law or rule of something else. Punishment, I guess that's very clear. This kind of part of this is a kind of weapon, right? And how you imprison people, if you look at this, gradually evolved into this kind of more moderate terms. I have some conclusions here, but I guess probably I will just stop here. I think the time is already up. I would be very happy to take some questions if you have. Thank you very much for your listening.
So thank you very much, Professor Yu, for that very stimulating lecture.